My watch is showing 7 p.m. So we're going to get started. Welcome everybody. Thank you for coming and to the well, technically spring concert, but we'll call it early summer concert of the Company Shops concert band. We have put together quite a long program of music that I hope you enjoy, but I wanted to kind of give you an introduction tonight because we have a theme, and I want you to understand what's going on before we start. We're going to take a little bit of a trip back in time, about 100 years to the early decades of the 20th century. It's a time of transition in music. You're coming out of the tail end of what's called the nationalistic composers, and every composer basically was trying to find ways in their music to build up and say, hey, I'm from this country and it's really great and our music is particular to us. So we're going to do a comparative journey across the pond between the UK and the United States, because those are the two areas where true band music was developing. The military bands had come about basically in the mid-1800s, around the time of the Civil War. You really started seeing actual just brass military bands, which, the invention of marches and things for that. And into the 20th century, it kind of became, okay, what are we going to do with this new thing of a band? Orchestra music started becoming a little bit passé, and band was the hot new thing. In the UK, the United Kingdom, they kind of reached backwards. You had a lot of the first really major band composers over there were like Gustav Holst, Percy Grainger, a little bit of Edward Elgar, and what they did is they looked back. The United Kingdom is a very old country. They looked back at their folk song, their roots, their past, the folk songs that had been passed down for literally hundreds, in some cases, almost 1,000 years. And they based a lot of their early band music on those folk songs. Whereas in the United States, we're a young country, so we're looking at, okay, what is going to be our legacy? So that's where, out of the spiritual of the late 19th century, African-American music created a new language of music that turned into like ragtime and then eventually into jazz and big band. So they're kind of pushing forward in time with newer things. So that's going to be kind of a comparison. A lot of the British, most of the pieces we're playing tonight, they're not like orchestral pieces that have been written, changed over to band. They are written for band. But you've got, on the other side of the pond where they're looking backwards towards their history, and over here where we're pressing forward to something new. So it's kind of a comparison between those two extremes of the European movement. We're going to start out on the British side, and the reason I wanted to talk about this first, British band music, their folk song adaptions, they tend to have a very particular style. They would take the tune, the bass thing on, and they would state it, and then the rest of the piece, they're playing it over and over and over again, and changing things under it, different accompaniment patterns, changing the time feel, changing the style from smooth to more marked and things. So especially this first piece is a very, very good example of that. You're going to hear the same tune played over and over and over again, and what's so cool about it is what he does underneath it. So we're going to start off with a Percy Grainger arrangement of the folk song, I'm 17 Come Sunday. Thank you. Now we're going to take the first flight back across. The next piece is called Big Bands in Concert. And this is kind of that transition from ragtime into jazz and big band. Jazz and big band kind of split off from each other at the same time period. Big band came into full flower in the mid-30s to early 40s. And this is three big band standards. One's called A String of Pearls, one called A Sophisticated Lady, and the third one is called Opus 1. With in between, you've got the arranger of this piece put in his own little lick in the middle. So, big band in concert. Just a slight difference. Well, we're going to get a lot of frequent flyer miles today, but we're going back. The next is another Percy Granger. It's called Irish Tune from County Derry. I don't think I will need to tell you what this piece is, but I'll just let you guess. that song was. Well, we are going to go back across again. The United States, throughout the 19th century, at this point it's just a little bit more than 100 years old. It's just getting its identity in the world culturally and hasn't been taken all that seriously in things like arts and whatnot. One of the first actual composers from the United States that really got kind of an international reputation is because he kind of created a quintessentially American sound. George Gershwin, a name I'm sure you guys have heard in a lot of American Airlines commercials. But yeah, he took the jazz idioms that were coming out in popular music, and he took it and put it into the mainstream, the classical, the artistic, the formal setting, the orchestral music of the day, and really made a name for American music in the world that previously had not existed. But again, it was by creating something with a traditional orchestra and band that used a completely new language, but in a traditional style. So we're going to be playing a medley of piece by George Gershwin. It's called a Gershwin Portrait. This time we're staying put. The next is an example of every band plays them, marches. But military marches have been around literally since the early 1800s. Several were written by the eldest Strauss. I mean, they've been going back. John Philip Sousa had started writing them in the 1880s. So, I mean, they've been around for a while. But again, we've got this new era, particularly in American music, where you've got the jazz idiom coming into every single form. So what we've got next is a march, but it's in a really different style than what you're used to. It's Henry Fillmore's Lazarus Trombones. Letting the Hillgrass having fun. We have one more piece for this half of the concert. I'm a little bit of a, I think the band thinks of me a little bit of a masochist because I plan these long concerts. But because it is such a lot of music, we're going to take about a 10-minute intermission after this next piece, so that's a good time for you guys to want to stretch your legs or use your restroom or anything you need to do. But the final piece in this half concert is the absolute classic that any band has to play at some point or another. This is the Holst First Suite for Band. Now, it's a little different than the other couple songs we've heard, British songs we've heard so far, in that he didn't actually use British folk songs. What he did is he wrote some tunes that sound like they should be British folk songs. And put them into 3 different styles. You have the 3 movements. Chaconne, which is a form of dance. Intermezzo, which is just kind of a bridge, and then the march, which I wanted to put this here because you'll hear, you just heard a march, an American style march, and now we're going to have a British march at the end of this, and I think you'll find it very interesting putting them back to back. So the whole first suite for band in E flat. lunch. Like I said, we are going to take about a 10-minute intermission here. When you hear the band start warming up again, that's the time to kind of start making your way back to your seats. Thank you. We'll see you in 10 minutes.
I wonder which instrument is harder. That looked harder.
Are we done?
I was going to stop it for a minute.
Yeah, you don't want to do that because this one's going. If you do that, then everybody that's watching will have to find I don't know where the power is.
I was literally trying to guide you to her.
That's right.
But it's okay. Check the others.
And then I was heading for you were looking
I don't know. That's sort of
Yeah, it is. So you're Gillette, right? That's a yes. Unfortunately, I'm not going to be in this unfortunately, it is much so neither I'm not going to be here for
okay, we're not going to be here for the next concert. It's going to be in Virginia. Yeah, the people will be great.
Oh yeah, I gotta go.
Yeah. My key concert. Oh, what is that? That's the thing.
Got a picture or something. And we got a hurricane, it doesn't wipe out the tornadoes. Hurricane, give me out, it's on the west. So I don't know if it's showing love or me.
Your hands are really big, right?
Hi, Doug. You sound good. Nice work. Why not? Oh, yeah. Well, yeah, that's don't touch. Go back. Go back. Yeah. Just stay longer and you'll get better.
Welcome to the second inning. We're going to start off with something a little bit more serious for the second half and a little bit out of the rest of the program. This concert is kind of sandwiched in between Memorial Day and the 4th of July. I wanted to make sure we had something patriotic on the program. The next piece is called Fight of Valor. It was written by James Swearingen in honor and remembrance of United Front 93 from 9/11 in 2001. So it's kind of a representation of, in the middle, you'll hear kind of the urgency and the action taken by the people who prevented a greater tragedy. But also, it's intertwined with the hymn, "It is well with my soul," in recognition of I'm not sure how to say it. It just the honor and these people accepted what the outcome that they were going to have, and they did it for a greater purpose. So, fight of that. That is just such a beautiful and majestic rendition of that hymn. I love it. We're going to go back and jump back into the cross-sea travel here. The next piece is back to Percy Granger. It's from a six-movement piece he wrote called Lincolnshire Posy, which is inspired by scenes from the area of Lincolnshire, Britain. It's a little bit more unusual piece for him. It used some slightly odd chords and timing things, but overall it's a similar thing. It's not using actually any particular folk song, but again, it's kind of a theme inspired by a British folk song. This particular movement that we're going to play, and I always pronounce it very badly, is Horkstow Grange.
Thank
That is just such a unique and haunting melody. Absolutely gorgeous. The next piece is also based on a British folk song. This particular British folk song had actually had a very long life and has kind of made its way into popular culture. So you might actually, if you're old enough, remember this from the 70s, the pop song. But I kid you not. This is Variations on Scarborough Fair. Thank you. That's a fun little piece that actually gets into a full fugue in there, so we had a lot of fun with that. The next piece I referenced at the beginning of the concert that a lot of the new American idiom and music grew up out of the 18th or 19th century African American spirituals. So, in recognition of that, we are going to be playing some spirituals. And one final one from the American stable. One of the very, very popular band leaders in the mid-30s was Duke Ellington. So we had to play one of his pieces. This is a standard I've never heard before, this arrangement, but I like it a lot. It's called Caravan. It's inspired by kind of a Middle Eastern feel. So I think you'll find it very interesting and enjoyable. Thank you very much. We have one more piece left to go, but before we play that, I just wanted to say thank you so much for coming to this concert. These performers have put a lot of time into this music, and we do this, nobody up here is paid, nobody, we do this because we love the music, we enjoy playing together, and we just are having fun. So thank you for coming so that we can have some fun with you. We really appreciate it. It just makes a huge, you know, we practice this, you know, for months at a time, but just having an audience that is so appreciative of what we do. Thank you so much. The last piece we're going to be playing is called West Highland Sojourn. It's another one that's kind of inspired by British folk songs without actually being them. This was 3 different movements, each depicting a scene from Scotland, from the Highlands. So enjoy West Highland Sojourn. Thank you all so much. You have a wonderful night.